I'm here at Apec with Bob Moritz, who is the global chairman of PWC, and my eyes and ears into the rooms I don't get to go. Bob, so you just, first of all, how is the conference so far for you, the Apec Summit?
We've been knowledge partner for 14 years. The sense of
That's why we hang out at the PWC booth.
Absolutely. The sense of interest in this one is at a particular peak. And you have two things that are happening. One is clearly the geopolitical overhang that's there, and particularly with President Biden and President Xi trying to come together and seeing what's coming out of that. So there's an eagerness and a buzz waiting to come across. The second, though, is a sense of urgency in terms of some of the big world challenges that are happening right now and the role that the Asia-Pacific region can play. And that's going to be important as you look at the next decade in terms of the importance of this region. So there's a sense of coming together and coming out in terms of the world stage and the role and the responsibility that these particular countries and the companies within them have to a worldwide economy.
Now, I know you're not a soothsayer, so you can't predict the outcome of any political discussions, but how have the tensions between the US and China impacted business, if at all?
Well, it has impacted, let's be clear on that. You have sort of three things that are discussed in the boardroom. It's actually impacting, do I invest or not? And that goes to in China, or for that matter, from China into the US.
Right.
So that's a big issue. Second is the cost of what's happening today. So the sanctions and the additional cost, and that goes to compliance costs, and that goes into uncertainty and time issues when people are making decisions. So having two sets of data, two different technologies in parts of the world, if you're a multinational, there's an extra complexity associated with that. So that becomes a problem. And then third is, how do I actually take advantage of the opportunities in each of these two countries? And can I? Should I? And if I'm not there already, am I willing to invest in it, or do I wait a little while to see a few more signs of thawing out before I actually make those decisions? Those are the things that are realities of what's happening in the boardroom today.
Can I follow up on that a bit? By the way, some global leader just walked by. I was like, I'm with Bob Moritz. But because politics is by its very nature, shifting, let's put it that way, these are long-term decisions that your clients make and you make. So will there be, if we see some sort of, thawing, detente, closer relations, is that going to have an immediate impact? Or do you think it's really still a wait and see?
It's still a bit of wait and see. The reality is today you're going to hear some high-level discussions coming out of two very senior leaders of the two largest economies in the world. And people have seen these dialogues before, and the question is, did they actually prove sustainable and fruitful? So what's going to be really important is going to be in the next 6 months what happens after this. Come back to the issue at hand. So think about supply chain, for example. China has historically had a competitive advantage because of the scale and the economics that came from that scalability. And historically, the world looked at China and said, okay, I'm really good because they got the skills, they've got the infrastructure, and they got the scalability. And therefore, it's the only place to go. So you had a concentration risk. But what they're looking at now is, let me think about that from are they going green fast enough? Are they giving me the data I need to manage my supply chain? Do I have stability in some of the rules, regulations, policies, and procedures? And if there's a little uncertainty there, it's going to slow down the decisions. Now, I'm not going to say it's going to stop them, because it won't, because the enormity of China is still going to mean it's going to be a very large player, but it may cause others to think about alternative sources.
So the counsel that you give your clients on those fronts, any insights you'd want to share with regard to some of those answers to those questions?
Yeah, the message is as follows. Number one, the supply chain decisions have to be actually brought much more so to the C-suite and not left to the middle management discussions, because they're too important to organizations. We saw that during COVID. Second is, are you actually assessing the right issues? And they have to be tied together. So if I'm sitting in an XYZ company that's made a 2030, 2040 commitment, if I'm not thinking about climate in my supply chain, I'm actually missing the boat. So I've got to actually connect a lot of dots. Third is, as you make these decisions, you're looking at a portfolio of supply chain alternatives for you now, because you want agility and speed and certainty. And the world may change pretty radically. You might have another pandemic that shuts something down. You might see a policy procedure that actually shuts something down, or maybe a cost that's so prohibitive. Can you pivot very quickly? So those are the things when you think about what successful companies will be doing going forward. It's going to be speed in decision making. It's going to be agility to move really fast in scale. And it's going to be the quality and experience of the leadership teams to take advantage of opportunities they see whenever they arise and minimize the downside risk from them as well.
So it's the geopolitical landscape. Ironically, the issues of Ukraine and certainly Israel, Hamas, et cetera, is not within the Apec region per se. Are those the big overhangs in terms of just global growth right now, or are there other issues? You mentioned China that you think are impacting how and where U.S. companies grow?
You've actually got the geopolitical overhang. You've got the macro economy uncertainty where you're slowing down and there's huge compression on the bottom line.
Do you see a recession coming?
I don't see a recession coming per se, but I think we're going to be around the edges on any given quarter in terms of positivity or negativity. And let's not focus so much on the technical definition of what a recession is, because I think that's the wrong thing to be focused on. But the third thing is the amount of capital that's needed to solve for some of these larger challenges. And where's that going to come from? If the world's economy is slowing down, how much capital do governments have and corporates have to actually make the investments to deal with education, food scarcity, AI, climate, et cetera? And that's the other aspect out there, that when organizations are thinking about this stuff, they get so tied up with that. Well, I'm going to give them the advice: control what you can control, and then scenario plan for the stuff you can't control. Because if you're just going to react to the headline news or some of these big monstrous issues, you'll be in a state of paralysis and never actually make any decisions. And that, Kenley, is the wrong thing for businesses. But the second thing I will say is that businesses have to understand they need to change. So in our last CEO survey, it was almost 60% in this particular region that said they're not going to survive if they don't radically change their businesses in the next decade. They'll be out of business.
Are they talking primarily about AI and generative AI? Because that's obviously a big shift since last year.
It's a big piece of it, but not the only piece. How they price, how they manage risk and compliance in a world where you're going to see a lot more fracturing of that in terms of each country, even this state, coming up with its own rules and regulations. There's a cost and complexity associated with that, and a big tail risk if you get it wrong. So it's all of those things. And then last but not least is, as we see the consumer change their buying patterns and their behaviors, are you quick enough to respond to those things as well? So there's a lot of different things in terms of the change that's coming that people have to be ready for.
One other question I want to ask you is the serendipity factor, because you go to a lot of events like this. You take the 30,000 foot view, and I'm sure you go deep when there's, problems in the organization and such, but what is on your radar in terms of anything here that thus far has surprised you, delighted you, any other economy you'd be keeping your eye on, since we tend to focus on the big traditional ones like China?
There's probably two things that have surprised me that have not been discussed very much yet. One is the connection between climate and AI. And if you think about this,
one is a tool to help the other?
Well, one's a tool, but also one's a liability. So the AI will be hugely impactful in terms of dealing with the energy efficiency necessary to actually deal with climate change. People tend to forget there's a huge amount of energy to actually fuel the AI.
Yeah.
And to be very specific and granular, I can think about a conversation with a CEO talking about, I'm going to go long AI, but you just made a 2025 commitment
at the same time.
Yeah, and these two things don't reconcile. So how do you connect those dots? The second thing for this part of the world is the implications to the labor force. Is the labor force being skilled? Yeah, two things. One is, are they being skilled to actually leverage the AI, both develop it and leverage it and use it? And second, is there job loss? And is there a period of time where there's a bit of a mismatch? Humanity over time has shown us there'll be an eventual catch-up. The question is, can you afford to do that in some of these countries? And the combination of AI with robotics really impacts manufacturing in a big-time way, and the countries here have been very human-dependent on that manufacturing over the last decade or two.
And yet it's interesting that 17 of the 21 APEC economies are having declining birth rates, so maybe long-term, like in Japan, robotics and AI will actually be something that's necessary to keep the economy growing.
Yeah, but then go to the other side when you look at the Malaysias, Indonesias, et cetera, in terms of how will you continue to create innovation to have enough jobs for the skilled labor that hopefully you actually have helped educate.
Anything else on your radar, Bob, you'd put on ours?
No, the big thing right now is how do leaders lead through these uncertain times? And that's where we're going to see.
Well, look, here you are, a leader leading in uncertain times. What advice do you have?
The couple of things I would say first and foremost is they got to have a degree of personal resiliency. And you better have some thick skin, because you're not going to please everybody. And we see that with any issue that you take a point of view on, because the world will text.
Protesters outside.
You name it, right, in terms of what happens. And oh, by the way, that brand, personal brand or corporate brand, can be changed in an instant with social media the way it is right now,
Right.
whereas a decade or two ago, you might never even hit the radar screen. So that's point number one. Point number two is, how do you have the right people around you as a leadership team? Because it's going to be the collective team that's going to be super important. And do they understand these big macro trends? And last but not least is, can they drive change at the scale necessary with the speed necessary? And that means change culture.
Yeah.
So there's going to have to be a cultural shift to deal with what I'm going to call the tax, Kenley, of the history of what we've had in the last 2 or 3, 4 decades. There's a bit of a penalty out there in terms of the gap that exists that we're going to have to transform ourselves to the next stage of life as we know it.
We have to now suddenly pay our debt
You
that
got
we've
it.
been accruing. Well, on that happy note, I suppose, or certainly food for thought. Thanks for joining us.
Happy to be here.